All right, today we are diving into the life of an absolute literary giant, George Bernard Shaw. I mean, we're talking a Nobel Prize winner, a truly brilliant playwright, and a social critic with a wit as sharp as a razor. But he was also a man of just staggering contradictions. He's a puzzle that, frankly, still fascinates and troubles us to this very day. And that brings us to this central question of this whole thing. How did the mind that gave us the incredible wit and deep humanity of plays like Pygmalion also end up championing some of the most brutal dictators of the 20th century? It's a really jarring paradox, and it's one we're going to try and unravel together. So let's start back in the 1880s. You've got a young Shaw, he's trying to find his voice, and he has two encounters that just completely change everything for him. First, he reads Karl Marx's Das Kapital, and it's like a lightning bolt. He is totally converted, convinced he's found the key to understanding society. And then he discovers the work of the Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen, and that shows him the revolutionary power of theater. These two giants, they would go on to shape his entire career. So what does he do with these new socialist beliefs? Well, he doesn't join some revolutionary party. Instead, in 1884, he joins the Fabian Society. Now you gotta understand, the Fabians were intellectuals. They believed that big change shouldn't come from a bloody uprising from the masses, but gradually, slow, steady reform guided by clever people, like themselves. Their motto was literally, make haste slowly. And this idea of an intellectual elite guiding society, that is an absolutely crucial piece of our puzzle. Remember that. Okay, so he's got his political cause, now he needs a platform. And he figures out pretty quickly that writing pamphlets or yelling on the street corner, well, that's only going to get you so far. He decided the real power was in the theater. So he sets out to completely transform the stage from a place of just simple entertainment into a pulpit, a lecture hall, a weapon for social change. And let's be clear, Shaw wasn't just writing plays. He was crafting what he himself called moral propaganda. He wanted to literally force his comfortable middle-class audiences to confront the ugly truths about the world they were living in. He wanted them to bring their brains and their consciences with them to the theater. He kicked things off with a series of works he bluntly called his plays unpleasant, and trust me, they were. Widowers' Houses just ripped the lid off how respectable fortunes were being built on the misery of people living in slums. The Philanderer went right after the sexist conventions of Victorian marriage, and then the most shocking of them all, Mrs. Warren's Profession, which argued that prostitution wasn't some moral failing, but the direct result of a capitalist system that underpaid and totally undervalued women. This is pure Shaw. It's provocative, it's uncomfortable, and it forces you to look at the world from a completely different and pretty brutal angle. He puts this harsh economic logic right in the mouth of a brothel owner, and in doing so, he challenges every single Victorian ideal about womanhood and respectability. He was making audiences hear the very voices they were trying so desperately to ignore. Now, as we mentioned, Shaw's big inspiration for this new kind of drama was Henrik Ibsen, but this wasn't some simple hero worship, not at all. Shaw's admiration was complicated, and as his own fame just exploded, it turned into this fascinating rivalry. He basically went from being Ibsen's biggest fan in England to his self-proclaimed successor. And you can literally watch this journey play out over time. In 1891, he's the loyal disciple, explaining the master's genius to everyone. By the late 1890s, he sees himself as an equal, critiquing Ibsen's work like a fellow professional. And then by the 1900s, with global fame, he starts to talk about Ibsen's work as this necessary but now kind of outdated step in the evolution of drama, an evolution that he, George Bernard Shaw, was now completing. You just have to love the audacity. This quote perfectly captures Shaw's legendary wit and his, colossal ego. He wasn't just standing on the shoulders of giants, he was pretty much claiming he built them the ladder. It just shows a man who was so keenly aware of his own place in history and absolutely determined to shape it. So, what was the big difference between them artistically? Well, it came down to this. Ibsen's plays are retrospective. They're like dramatic archaeology. They peel back layers of the past to reveal some hidden secret. But Shaw's plays, they're all about the future. They use discussion, debate, argument to ask the question, okay, so where do we go from here? His plays weren't just about diagnosing a problem, they were arguments for a whole new world. And that question, where do we go from here? This is what led Shaw down a very, very dark philosophical path. His desire for a better world, combined with this deep skepticism he had about ordinary people, it all led to a really dangerous admiration for authoritarianism. At the heart of it was this theory he called creative evolution. He totally rejected Darwin's idea of natural selection. Instead, he argued that humanity could evolve by pure force of will, driven by something he called a life force. And who would guide this grand evolution? Not the masses, no. It will be guided by superior individuals, philosophers, Superman. And you can see how this dangerous logic just builds, one step at a time. First, he loses faith in the Marxist idea that the working class will be the agents of change. He just found them disappointing. So he needs a new engine for progress, this abstract life force. And that force? Well, it needs a driver, a Superman, a benevolent dictator who could just cut through all the messiness of democracy and will a better world into being. The real-world results of this philosophy were horrifying. He started seeing his supermen in the actual dictators of his time. He praised the so-called efficiency of Benito Mussolini. He became one of the most famous and vocal apologists for Joseph Stalin, seeing the Soviet 5-year plans as the ultimate triumph of his old Fabian ideas. He even, and this is just chilling, referred to the founder of the Soviet secret police as the gentle Dzerzhinsky. This might be the most chilling quote of all. This is how he justified Stalin's purges, which killed millions of people. Weeding the garden. That abstract philosophical theory had found its brutal, real-world expression. For Shaw, the murder of political opponents was basically just a form of social horticulture. So what are we left with? We're left with these two figures, these two Shaws, who seem absolutely impossible to reconcile, living inside the same man. The brilliant artist who fought for the oppressed, and the cold-blooded ideologue who made excuses for tyrants. How do you even begin to make sense of that? I mean, the paradox is just laid bare when you put them side by side. On one hand, you've got the humanist, the man who tirelessly championed women's rights, who used his genius to expose poverty and hypocrisy, who created some of the most vibrant female characters in the history of the stage. And on the other hand, you've got the apologist, the man who lost all faith in democracy and justified mass murder in the name of progress. You know, maybe the sharpest verdict on Shaw came from a really surprising source, the Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin. He famously called Shaw a good man fallen among Fabians. Lenin saw Shaw's tragedy as a political one, that his brilliant socialist instincts got trapped and twisted by an elitist, anti-revolutionary philosophy that, in the end, led him to admire the dictator's boot. And so that leaves us with this final, really difficult question. Bernard Shaw gave us plays that are witty, they're humane, they're profoundly challenging. He also lent his considerable voice and intellect to defending tyranny. So what do we do with that? Can we separate the art from the artist, or are they forever tangled together? It's a question that remains just as unpleasant and just as necessary as one of his own plays.